In a lot of shooters that we've been blessed with, the vast majority of them often have a main source of inspiration that is used as a template to build upon in the effort to build something newer or something more refined. In the indie scene, we see lots of Quake or Doom-inspired shooters, more specifically boomer shooters, but sometimes we also get like Half-Life or Call of Duty or Halo-inspired shooters, which the core elements are taken from them and are then manipulated into an entirely new product. But what about the game Fear, a game released from 2005? How come we don't see as many indie shooters inspired by that game? It's something I've wondered myself, and even with today, I'm generally hard-pressed to find something with the same kind of tension and action mixed with horror in the same way as the first Fear. There are more indie shooters inspired by other games than the game that I just mentioned, and it's honestly pretty disappointing. That is to say, if I don't factor in the game that I'll be talking about very shortly, a game that I was genuinely excited for the moment I saw its announcement and had played the demo, and it's one of my favourite games this year, Trepang2, which by the way, Trepang apparently means sea cucumber, so keep that in mind. Trepang2 is a fast-paced slow-mo based shooter that creates a fusion of action and horror, not unlike the way Fear does, where the overwhelming presence of enemies creates the action, and the unknown and terrifying anomalies that come up make up the horror that is in this game. It was on top of my most anticipated shooters because it was in one way a return to form and successor to a game that I love, and also a damn fine shooter that is well worth your time. As for the name of the game itself, it was originally a placeholder name for the project during its early stages of development, but as time went on and the demo gained traction, they had decided to keep the name so that a name change wouldn't necessarily stop the marketing buzz that it had already created. It's a terrible name, but under those circumstances it's understandable. This game is a reflection of the rise of fast-paced games, on either the single-player or multiplayer spectrum. Ultra Kill is one such game that has a healthy player base on Steam that doesn't seem to slow down, and with Act 3 on the horizon, it's only going to get bigger. Severed Steel was another indie game that I played that had slow-mo mechanics alongside its own unique style of play that made it fun. Then there's Maximum Action, another slow-mo game that's heavily inspired by the late 80s era of action movies that's quite fun, and it's a shame that it isn't talked about as much. And that's just the single-player side. For multiplayer, you have plenty of options like Apex Legends, Quake, Team Fortress 2, the combat surf scene in CSGO, Warframe, Titanfall 2, the list goes on, and yes, even Call of Duty to an extent is pretty fast-paced. But Trepang2 is fast and slow at the same time, and it's an absolute blast, and quite literally a blast from the past experience for those that had played the Fear franchise. When I had first played the demo, I could feel that the Fear franchise had some sort of influence on the tone and the gameplay of Trepang2. Some have said that this game isn't quite like Fear 1, and to be honest, it's true, at least from a gameplay standpoint anyways. It does have some of the horror elements of Fear 1, but with more anomalies and background stories rather than just being centered around one small girl in a red dress that can liquefy a person in seconds. Gameplay-wise, I would say it's more like the later entries, more specifically Fear 3. The third installment's gameplay was decent, it was a lot faster, and even better when you're playing co-op, but the game overall was ultimately a lackluster experience that left a sour note for me, and Fear 2 was even worse on that note. Fear 1's gameplay was great, but it's a lot slower in comparison to Trepang 2, where you're constantly running around and darting all over the shop, throwing grenades, grabbing enemies and pulling their grenade pins, only to throw them against their comrades, which is fun by the way. Sliding, jumping, all of that jazz. Fear 1 is too dated in comparison to say that Trepang is just like the first one when it really isn't in terms of gameplay. But like I said, it does have elements of horror from the first game and gameplay elements from Fear 3, and does maintain the overall horror and tension of the experience. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on to the rest of the game. Trepang 2's story is quite frankly negligible. You play as someone named 106. You start off as supposedly a prisoner in a facility watching TV. Someone shoots the screen and opens the door. You find your way out and eventually you find a gun and some new clothes. And from here on out, a fight inevitably breaks out and you're pretty much doing all of the combat stuff I just mentioned earlier. After you escape, you are introduced to Task Force 27, who tell you that the Horizon Corporation have kept you away for a long time and that they need your help in bringing them down. They bring you to a base and from there on, you can go about and explore the base. Change your armor, try out the practice simulation mode that lets you go against waves of enemies, or go to the mission control room where you can pick up either the main missions or the side missions. And from beginning to end, this is how the game progression works. You do the missions, select the difficulty, complete the objectives, finish mission, return to base, rinse and repeat. You also have a lot of reading that you can do by picking up intel that you can find in each mission. But reading is one of those things that I'm on and off with, and it only works when I'm genuinely interested in the game's setting and story. The setting itself is pretty cool, but the story is kind of meh, and in effect would lead me to ignore the reading part even when I did pick up intel. The enemies try to be somewhat like the replicas from Fear. They're barking out orders, coordinating with each other, swearing their heads off and screaming when they lose a limb or get a fistful of bullets. They'll try to flank you or throw grenades to flush you out. On the higher difficulties, they become an even bigger threat, and it gets to a point where the difficulty can sometimes even be unfair. On the highest of difficulties like Extreme or Rage mode, you really have to be able to use your equipment and your abilities to the fullest, as well as avoiding open areas whenever possible, to have any chance of surviving. You have your enemy soldiers that carry different weapons, or ones that wear a lot of heavy armor and require shooting their weak points to finish them off. Later on though, you end up fighting these weird humanoid creatures that vomit on you, and when you reach Jorvik Castle, you end up fighting the cultists, who are kind of similar to the soldiers except that they have these dudes running towards you, only for them to light themselves up and give you a warm hug. In between the enemy variety that you also have the high value targets, who are characters that appear in missions or in specific circumstances that have backstories and can appear, giving you an opportunity to hunt them down and take them off the list that you can see in the mission control room. Some of them you actually have to play on the higher difficulties for them to even show up, which is where the replay option comes in, letting you do them again mainly just to get all the targets and, well, completing the difficulties themselves. Extreme and Rage mode is more on the masochistic side of things, and I would not recommend tackling them until you've at least beaten the game once. Speaking of which, it's quite short, which is honestly the most disappointing thing about this game. Most people will be able to beat this within a couple of hours, whereas with the first Fear, it had a much longer length, and I truly felt I got my money's worth at the time. But with Trepang2, if it weren't for the side missions or the endless mode, or the fact that you can replay any mission, my opinion of the game would be a lot less charming overall. But what is there is 50-50, mission-wise. I like the fact that they go for a SCP-inspired setting, where you have the experimental monstrosities and also the anomalous places that cause some weird shit to happen, like one specific mission, Site 83, which is my favorite one in the game, side mission-wise. And well, yeah, it's a Backrooms inspired level basically. This was the sort of stuff that I liked about the setting of this game, how it sort of creates a SCP and Backrooms hybrid within a Fear inspired game, where you have these mysterious organizations and anomalies and places that occurred within the game. But what I really don't like, to be honest, is the shift from one location to the next, or at least the disconnect between them. Fear's story took place within one central area but had different points of interest over time. In Trepang2, there's a sort of disconnect that often changes the tone and pace of the first level that had already set in motion. The locational variety is great, but I would have preferred a more linear structure where you go from one level to the next like in the Fear games, rather than having to return to the base every single time, selecting a mission and running back to the helicopter again. Now, they added the hub-based structure that is the HQ for replayability reasons, and I get that, but unfortunately, there just isn't enough content overall to justify it in my opinion. But the gunplay more than makes up for it. This game has some of the most satisfying levels of gunplay that I've enjoyed in a shooter for quite some time. It's fast, but not at the speed of lightning, slowed down enough where you can comprehend the action, not to mention the combination of the game's sound and kick-ass music, making for a pulsating effect when you get into a flow state, which is something that you often see in pro players within the esports scene. Its balls-to-the-wall approach is something that has its own unique flavor that separates it from all of the Doom and Quake-inspired boomer shooters that we've been getting since 2016, as well as some of the other shooters that have cropped up in the market. And another thing, would highly recommend balancing out the sound because while it's sonically great, it's also stadium levels of loud, especially when it comes to the explosions, so don't play it too loud if you care at all for your ears. The weapons themselves feel great to use, and the shotgun is a worthy successor to the shotgun in Fear 1. Sounds great, turns enemies into paste or splits them like the Red Sea. It is destructive as it should be, and it's even better when you finally get the syringe that lets you dual wield the weapons. Some of the other weapons are quite good, like the piercer weapon that nails enemies to a wall, or when you use the 3-round grenade launcher that creates lots of explosions. Also, throughout the game, the enemies often carry different weapons, so sometimes you might have one specific weapon, say a sniper rifle. You may have to either hold on to it and hope for more ammo, or just get rid of it entirely. Some of the weapons have different attachments that you can find, and sometimes you can find cases that give you an attachment to use that you can add onto the weapon, and you can either hold on to that or just find another one. I like how the game also gives you some customization options regarding the weapons, so you could add like a scope or a suppressor. It adds for different kinds of effects. There's like a good and bad effect to each attachment that you have, but it's not mandatory in order to progress through the game, but it's still an option to give your weapon more customization if you want it. For the sneaky beaker crowd, you also have a stealth option too, where you use a cloak to hide your presence. The thing is a lifesaver to take a breather from hairy engagements, and yes, I didn't realize this until after I beat the game, that running doesn't affect the duration of it, so I blame Crisis for the habit of crouching while in cloak. In terms of movement, it's fast and smooth, with the sliding and jumping adding a degree of verticality into the combat. You can jump kick and grab enemies and use them as meat shields, or like I said, throw them at enemies with the grenade pin pulled. The combat options are fantastic, and you feel like a genuine badass when you pull it off successfully. This element is the heart and soul of the game, a different type of shooter that we don't have enough of, a woo shooter, some even call it, and I want even more of this. But for now, this and a few others like Sulaco, Severed Steel, and Maximum Action is all we have for the new generation of fear-inspired shooters where it takes the John Woo approach to the action, with particles flying everywhere and characters moving around like madmen. Trepang2 is fantastic, chaotic, and also exhilarating in all of the good ways. The campaign could have been longer and the story better developed, but what holds it together is the polished sense of gunplay that's complemented by its great sound design, environments, and general atmosphere in its music. I do hope that the studio makes another installment that expands more on what the game's already accomplished, preferably a longer experience too, I might add. If you're looking for a Woo-style shooter or something that is somewhat similar to Fear, then this is the best option out there so far. Definitely pick this one up, it's well worth the money. Thank you for watching.
Target identified. It's Subject 106. Alright. We gotta even the playing field. I need a fucking airstrike now! Copy. Breaking off from target. Commencing airstrike.